Laura Jones, you're with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, which of course represents small businesses in Canada. I read a very interesting statement the other day, small business too big to fail. How are we doing though? How are we doing right now? What's the landscape look like? And then let's talk about where we go from here to ensure that those businesses survive, because they really, it's too much to have fail.
Small businesses, yeah, too small to fail. I really like, I saw that same headline and I really like that headline. I think we need to do more to flatten the curve on small business failure. Things are pretty desperate right now. And, when you talk about small businesses, as you know, it's a group of people that have a lot of resilience, tend to be quite optimistic. Um, and there's for sure some of that among our members, but there's also a lot of anxiety and it's more than anxiety, it's fear. It's really fear for the future of their business.
Before we started the interview online, you were telling me that you normally field about 40,000 calls from your members over the course of the year, and you've had 10,000 in the last week. What is the general tone of those calls right now? What are they hoping that you can bring to their situation?
Well, in many cases, governments are making announcements before they've really figured out the details that come behind those announcements. So you'll have an announcement, for example, of a 75% wage subsidy is a good example, but with no details available or where do you apply, how do you apply, who's eligible, and then those things start to come in a little bit later, and that's totally understandable. It's not a criticism of government at this point. They're working as quickly as they can to get information out, but it poses some challenges, obviously, because then businesses have lots of questions about those things, and they're calling us for answers. And I think we're doing a good job of getting them the answers that are available and making it clear where it's just we're still waiting for that to come. We're also doing webinars, which have been incredibly well attended. I think we've helped about 5,000 businesses through our webinars, and I've been participating in some of those. Really interesting to hear what the questions are, and they really revolve around, what do I do about staff? How do I pay my bills? And how do I stay sane? I think those are the top three buckets of questions that we're getting.
Well, I started this series because I was hoping that small business people could share some of their ideas with one another. One that I thought was very innovative. Okay, I can't pay my rent this month, but when I signed the lease, I gave the landlord a first and last month rent deposit check. I'm not asking for rent relief, but could you take that deposit and apply it against my rent for this month, and maybe in the future we can make the deposit whole, but at least it allows me to ensure that I'm going to get through. Are you hearing creative ideas like that coming out of those webinars?
Of course, adversity always, pushes people to be creative, and it's sometimes when you're the most down that you have to get the most creative and innovative about how you're going to do things. And I think that's a great suggestion, the one you just talked about, using your first and last month's rent to pay off current bills. And many of our members, rent is a big challenge. It's one of the big fixed costs for businesses, and many of them have come up with creative arrangements with their landlords, and that's one of the basic pieces of advice that we have for businesses that are struggling to pay their bills is, in the same way that you'd want your customers to talk to you and come up with an arrangement, talk to them, see if you can come up with some kind of creative arrangement. And many, of course, not all, but many landlords are small business owners too, and many of them are being really good about it. So we've also unfortunately heard the opposite, but that's certainly helped businesses through April. I think the concern many have is if April was really, tough but manageable, May, that's going to be, it gets exponentially harder as your revenues are down or you may be closed altogether and the bills are still piling up.
Yes, it's true. Now, earlier you mentioned about the fact that government, they're in a tough spot. They have to react quickly. They have to react to an entirely new environment, but they're making policies that sometimes can be counterproductive. One business owner that I was talking to said, okay, my restaurant's closed. I've shifted now into doing takeout, and so I want to start to bring some of my staff back. But the EI suddenly is more generous than the wage. And so he's now actually having to give employees a pay raise to get them to come back, because otherwise they're saying, no, I think I'll just stay at home because I'm making more money just by staying at home. So, finding these balances and working our way through all of this is going to take quite a bit of work.
Takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of patience on everyone's part. And the business owner you're referring to is not alone. We're hearing a lot of challenges with respect to staffing, and that costs are increasing in this environment for some of the reasons that you described, that people are having to pay more to get staff who are willing to come in. We're hearing business owners tell us that staff are scared to come in, even if the business isn't forced to be closed. So these are very real challenges. And one thing I will say that I think governments are doing a good job, they're crafting kind of policy on the fly, really, but they are being somewhat responsive to, and this is one thing we're telling all of our members as they're filling in our surveys, we're getting like 10,000 responses over a weekend when we send out the surveys, and then we're getting that out to policymakers across Canada. And I will say that policymakers are pretty hungry for that level of detail and those concerns, and they are trying to go back and kind of patch together or fix some of the things that aren't working as well. That's going to be patient work, and that's not all going to happen overnight. But the other big concern we're hearing is around thresholds, right? So, if, for example, to be eligible for the Canada Emergency Business Account, you have to have $50,000 of payroll, between $50,000 and $1 million of payroll. What if you have $1.1 million or $49,000 of payroll, and you're struggling? So there's all kinds of these things that we're saying, hey, I think we need to be more flexible maybe than we imagined at the beginning of this, because it looks like it's going on longer than maybe what we were first imagining.
So do you have, and I know that it's very, very difficult, especially with the so many different sectors in which small and medium-sized businesses fall into as categories are concerned, but are there a series of things that people who are running these businesses need to pay attention to that will help them hopefully extend whatever reserves or resources that they have to ensure that the long end of this tail of the crisis isn't going to be just one financial disaster after another as small businesses would close?
One giant debt nightmare when you're out the other side of this, for sure. It's tricky. I mean, and I think the policy is going to continue to evolve, and some of what might be deferrals may end up being, forgivable. So that's certainly something that we're likely to be pushing a lot harder on as we're hearing that's certainly what small business owners don't need to come out of this with a huge pile of debt. So there's a lot of uncertainty around that. Of course, it always makes sense to look at your financial situation, what you can afford. A lot of our members are saying they're dealing with wages and rent first, and then they're trying to. But communicate is probably a really key principle. The other bit of advice that we're giving people, and I think that in a crisis sometimes, you just get into the hurly-burly of dealing with every day, but we are recommending keep a log, keep a business journal with some of your thinking, some of your decision-making, your conversations with government, the state of your business. That's not only to help you reflect on the here and now, but also when this is over, and the auditors may be coming back and asking you to remember what your rationale was for saying that, you were only going to pay 75%, you weren't going to top up that wage subsidy, or what your rationale was around your layoffs, that you'll have that recorded, and you think you're going to remember, but we all think we're going to remember, and then we go back and say, why didn't I write that down? So I think that's a best practice, and that can also kind of help you stay sane through this, just to kind of keep a daily record of what's going on in your business.
One of the other recommendations that I think that I would make would be, wherever possible, pay your taxes and pay them on time. Because while the government is saying, yeah, we're going to do a whole bunch of the things to forgive you, Revenue Canada pays very close attention to what you do and don't owe, and when you didn't pay. I think that it's very important to make sure that you maintain your status with the CRA.
Yeah, I think paying the bills that you can. I mean, I think this is important for everybody. Not just for business owners, but I think paying the bills you can. Certainly, when we surveyed business owners about what customers can do, it's paying bills early if they can, and making sure they are paying as much as they can. And I think that's good advice to keep everything going. The other important thing that you're bringing up here is that as you're looking, there are some taxes that have been deferred, but in some cases, the payment is deferred, but the filing deadline is not deferred. So you still have to file even if you don't have to pay. In other cases, both have been deferred. So it's a bit of a patchwork quilt, I would say. And on our website at cfib.ca, we have a table that just gives you sort of the basics on that, both at the federal and provincial level, that may be helpful, because you want to kind of keep track of that. And again, if you have a journal, you can also keep track of, okay, I deferred paying this, CRA, but I did file. And some of them you can't defer, by the way. So EI and CPP, no deferrals there. So make sure you're paying those taxes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Are you also hearing from your members who are saying, okay, now because I have staff working at home and we don't have anybody in the office, we have to pay more attention to ensuring that our premises are secure, because there's opportunity for people who would prey on situations like this?
You're certainly seeing a lot of that in the community, aren't you? You're seeing a lot of retail businesses that are boarded up. Even I've seen some restaurants that are open for takeout, boarded up. And I'm downtown here in Vancouver. It's kind of like a ghost town out there. So I think there are certainly some of those concerns that you're seeing. We're not hearing that so much on our webinars or our surveys or people asking questions about that. Maybe it's just more common sense, and people are just doing it where they feel they should or they need to, but you're certainly seeing that.
So, you mentioned earlier about the fact that we are talking about business owners, entrepreneurs, people who are innovators and who are looking for a way of remaining positive. How important is it from a leadership perspective that the people who are leading companies and doing everything they can to get through this remain hopeful and positive about what the outcome of this might be?
I think there's two sides to that. I think, of course, as a leader, it's important to be calm and positive. But in order to nurture that in yourself, you can't land the plane without the pilot. And so, it sounds almost cliche to say look after yourself, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's really, really critical. And I was talking to my mother, who was a small business owner, and her business actually burned to the ground. I remember I was about 12 years old. I actually remember when she got the phone call telling her that she had a small picture framing company, and all of her equipment, all of her records, all of her tax filing records, everything burned to the ground. And not only that, she was between insurance companies. So she had kind of, like many small business owners, it's tough to pay your bills sometimes. And she thought, I'm moving. She was going to move in a month. And so she thought, well, I can just sort of get away with not doing my insurance until I move. And she let that. So she was absolutely kicking herself for that decision, as you can imagine. But she said there were a couple things that helped her. One was asking for help after she got over the shock of it. But the second thing was her brother told her, if you didn't have the energy to move forward and carry on, you wouldn't be in small business. Now, I think for a lot of small business owners, moving on and carrying forward, it's not all going to look like the same. It's not all going to be the same thing. But you have to kind of trust that you've got that resilience. If you're in small business, you do have the energy to move forward. But looking after yourself at this critical time where there's so much uncertainty is really important. But it can be done. My mother rebuilt her business from scratch, and imagine the calls she had to make to CRA and her suppliers. One of the things, interestingly enough, you mentioned the first month's rent and the last month's rent earlier in the conversation. That was one of the things she did. She had a new space. She had nothing in it, no furniture, no equipment. But she said, I had that. I had paid the deposit for my rent, so I had a month to pull myself together and get things moving again. And her suppliers were really helpful. They gave her a lot of credit. She's to this day grateful to Opus, if I can give a shout out to a local business here, for how generous they were. And CRA was pretty good too. So that helped her, and she moved on.
Well, I've been talking to a number of business owners, and they're immediately, of course, looking for ways to create cash flow. And so they're doing things that they wouldn't have considered before. And
Yeah.
the opportunity maybe didn't exist. And so there is a tremendous amount of opportunity. You remember Jeff Lee from the Vancouver Sun. He went off to
Yes.
become a honeybee farmer. Well, I did an interview with him yesterday, and he said, one of the things that's been identified is that we get our queen bees flowing in from around the world, so that they're here to produce colonies that can go out and pollinate as soon as we can start to work in agriculture. He said we did that because you can't harvest queen bees until June or July in Canada, so it was just easier to bring them in. Well, now all of a sudden we realize there's a vulnerability there, but it also
Yeah.
created an opportunity. So Jeff and other beekeepers are now starting to look after securing a supply here in Canada, an opportunity that nobody probably would have paid any attention to, except for the fact that now that opportunity exists. And so I'm encouraged by the fact that we have so many business leaders that are looking for innovative ways to move forward. So I like to wrap up these interviews with a quote that helps you at times when you're sort of going, oh, okay, this is really getting to me. Is there a quote that you turn to and you go, yeah, thank you for that moment of inspiration, because sometimes you just need it?
Oh, what a great question. I think the one actually that's really been getting me through these tough times right now is the one from my mother when which I think originally came from her brother, but was, if you didn't have the energy to get through this and have a future, you wouldn't be in small business. And as as we're helping thousands of business owners who have really, in some cases, really tough stories, that's been something that's very helpful. I also take a lot of inspiration from our surveys and the some of the things that business owners are telling us in terms of the more hopeful. They've got a lot of hopeful quotes. One of them said that he was channeling Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he said about small business, "We'll be back." And so that's another one that made me smile.
Well, one of the other quotes that I like from Arnold Schwarzenegger is, "Don't listen to the naysayers." But I'm going to come back to a quote that I shared in another interview like this a few programs ago, which comes from Perry Bellegarde, who is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. And I am finding this to be true as I'm navigating my way through this challenge, because I'm a small business. And that is that without relationships, you can't build anything. And so it comes down to relationships. And it really does. You were talking about asking for help. Well, you're going to get help from those people that you built a positive relationship with in the past. And this is a way to consolidate and solidify those relationships as we go into the future. Because the only way we're going to get through this is to do it together.
So true. So true.
Yeah.
We're going to do it together.
Thank you, Laura, and best of luck to you, and of course to everybody else who has really put themselves out there to try and keep their businesses going. The Canadian economy needs us. Thank you.
Thank you.